Welcome to the Deep Dive. I am your host, and today we are going to get into some really foundational stuff.
Yeah, I'm here to provide the expert analysis, and I have to say this is one of my favorite topics to unpack.
Awesome. So let's jump right in. Think back to 1948. The United Nations drafts the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Right, a massive moment in history.
Exactly. They officially declare that every single person on Earth has a fundamental right to life, liberty, a fair trial, freedom from torture, all the big ones. But here is the crazy part. It took them like 74 more years to officially declare that you have a fundamental right to the actual air you breathe.
It really is wild when you frame it like that. It highlights this massive blind spot in our historical legal systems.
A total blind spot, yeah.
Because for a very long time, human rights law and environmental science were just treated as entirely separate universes. I mean, you had human rights lawyers arguing in one court about political freedom, and then completely separately, environmentalists arguing in a different court about, ozone depletion or deforestation.
Like they weren't even related.
Right. They rarely spoke the same language.
And that is exactly why we are diving into our source material today. We are exploring the precise moment those two separate universes finally collided. The document on the table for this deep dive is United Nations General Assembly Resolution, ARES 76300.
A very catchy title.
Oh yeah, rolls right off the tongue. But it was officially adopted during the 76th session on July 28, 2022. And the actual title of the resolution is basically the entire thesis statement. It's called The Human Right to a Clean, Healthy, and Sustainable Environment.
And just adding those three words, human right to right in front of a clean environment, it completely alters the global legal landscape.
How so?
Well, it changes the environment from just like a nice-to-have policy goal into a non-negotiable baseline for human existence. Our mission today is to really parse through this declaration. We're going to examine the foundational arguments the UN is using to justify exactly why the health of the planet is intrinsically linked to your most basic human rights.
So to give everyone listening a sense of what we're actually looking at, the source material comes with some visual context that really sets the tone for this.
Yeah, the visuals are super interesting.
Right. At the top, you have the iconic UN logo, the globe framed by the olive branches. It instantly communicates the diplomatic weight and the massive scale of this resolution. But then, right next to it, there are two incredibly mundane, everyday images.
Just right there on the document.
Yeah, a standard recycling symbol and a QR code.
Which is such a brilliant juxtaposition because it bridges the gap between this high-level international law and, well, your daily life.
Exactly.
It signals that this massive global resolution is actually about the immediate physical surroundings of every single person on Earth.
Okay, let's unpack this. When I look at this resolution, I keep thinking about it in tech terms.
Oh, I like that. Go on.
Can we view this document as a massive software update to international human rights law? Like they are finally patching a vulnerability in the original 1948 code that the architects just simply didn't understand back then.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it, actually. Because the original architects of human rights law post-World War II, they were entirely focused on immediate visible atrocities caused by governments.
Right, like dictatorships, censorship, false imprisonment.
Exactly. The existential threat of a slowly collapsing global ecosystem simply wasn't on their radar in 1948. So this document is the UN formally acknowledging a critical hardware dependency. If the physical environment crashes, the human rights software just cannot run.
That makes so much sense, but I'm assuming they didn't just wake up one morning in July 2022 and suddenly realize this, right? The opening of this document reads a bit like like a legal genealogy. They're really tracing the lineage of this idea.
Yeah, they definitely are. The UN is showing its work here. Because to understand what this resolution actually does, you have to understand the foundation it was built upon.
It goes pretty far back.
It does. The text explicitly points all the way back to the Stockholm Declaration of 1972.
Wow, 1972.
Yeah. That was really the first major international conference where nations sort of woke up and realized that things like industrial smog and acid rain, they don't respect national borders. It was the first time the environment was framed as a truly global issue.
Right, because smog doesn't stop at customs.
Exactly. And then the text traces the evolution forward to the Rio Declaration in 1992, which was a huge milestone because it started bringing the concept of economic development into the environmental conversation.
So they're building this 50-year paper trail to prove this isn't some radical new whim.
Right, it's a natural progression.
But the document also heavily references something much more recent, which is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And there is a concept in there that I actually want to push back on for a second.
Okay, let's hear it.
So the text notes that sustainable development has 3 dimensions that need to be balanced: economic, social, and environmental.
Yes, the 3 pillars.
Right. But later in the resolution, it explicitly states that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, is the greatest global challenge. So here's my question. If eradicating poverty is labeled as the absolute greatest challenge, doesn't that inherently give the economic pillar priority? Like if a developing nation has to choose between chopping down a forest to build an industrial sector to lift its people out of poverty, or saving the trees and staying poor, doesn't this document basically give them permission to prioritize the economy?
That's a really common critique, but if we connect this to the bigger picture, the text is actually arguing the exact opposite of that traditional assumption.
Really? How so? It literally says poverty is the greatest challenge.
It does say that, yes. For a long time, the prevailing logic was exactly what you just described. You know, you have to burn the forest to grow the economy, and only once you are rich can you afford the luxury of environmental protection.
Right, that's been the standard playbook.
But this resolution fundamentally rejects that playbook. It explicitly argues that protecting ecosystems contributes to human well-being and is an indispensable requirement for eradicating poverty.
Indispensable.
Yeah. It frames the environment not as a competitor to the economy, but as the actual bedrock it sits on. I mean, think about the mechanics of it.
Okay.
If a community relies on agriculture and poor environmental management leads to desertification or, say, the loss of local pollinators, their entire economic foundation just vanishes.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
You can't eradicate poverty if the soil is dead and the water is toxic. So the text is saying that long-term economic and social development is mathematically impossible without the environmental dimension holding it all up.
Okay, that completely flips it. So if the environment is the bedrock that our human rights and our economic survival rely on, then we need to look at what exactly is threatening to crack that bedrock.
And the UN is very thorough about that.
They really are. They don't just broadly gesture at, like, pollution. They list a very specific catalog of damage.
They are very precise. They highlight the compounding crises of our era. They point to the impacts of climate change, the unsustainable management of natural resources, the pollution of air, land, and water.
It's a long list.
It is. They also specifically call out the unsound management of chemicals and waste, the resulting loss of biodiversity, and the decline in services provided by ecosystems.
You know, the phrase unsound management of chemicals and waste brings me right back to that recycling symbol on the cover of our source material.
Oh yeah, the visual tie-in.
Right. Because normally when I see a recycling symbol on a plastic bottle, I just think of it as a mundane chore, like, I just have to sort my trash.
Exactly, it's just garbage day.
But reading this legal text, it recontextualizes it entirely. It makes you realize that throwing a toxic battery into a landfill isn't just an administrative waste management issue. It is a microscopic piece of a macro human rights violation.
Precisely. The text states unambiguously that these specific environmental threats interfere with the enjoyment of a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment.
But let me ask about the legal mechanics here. Instead of using a broad metaphor, let's think about this like changing the zoning laws in international courts.
Okay, I'm with you.
If the UN declares this a human right, obviously it doesn't instantly clean up the air, but does it create a new legal framework where you can suddenly sue a polluter, not just for property damage, but for an actual human rights violation? How does the UN explain the mechanism of environmental damage translating into a loss of human rights?
It does exactly that. The resolution states that environmental degradation has negative implications, both direct and indirect, for the effective enjoyment of all human rights.
So how does that play out in the real world?
Let's look at how that works in practice. If a river is polluted by industrial runoff, the right to safe drinking water is directly violated.
Right, you literally can't drink the water.
Exactly. If climate change induces a massive drought that destroys crops, the right to food is violated. If rising sea levels swallow a coastal community, the right to adequate housing and self-determination is violated. The UN is clearly articulating that environmental damage isn't just a physical phenomenon. It is a mechanism that actively strips people of their existing legal rights.
And that leads directly to a very uncomfortable truth that the resolution addresses head-on. Because The burden of this rights violation is definitely not shared equally.
Not at all.
Like, if climate change is stripping away housing and food rights, it's hitting certain zip codes and certain demographics way harder and way faster than others.
Yeah, the document is very clear that the impact is intensely unequal. It explicitly names the populations that are feeling these consequences most acutely.
Who do they single out?
It lists those already in vulnerable situations: indigenous peoples, children, older persons, and persons with disabilities.
Let's drill into that for a second. Why indigenous peoples specifically? I mean, I know they are historically marginalized, obviously, but what is the specific mechanical reason they are highlighted in an environmental resolution?
Because indigenous populations often have a direct, unmediated reliance on their local ecosystems for physical and cultural survival.
Okay, that makes sense.
If you live in a modern city and a forest burns down 1,000 miles away, your food still shows up at the grocery store. But for many indigenous communities, the forest or the river is the grocery store, it's the pharmacy, and it's the cultural center.
Right. The connection is immediate.
Exactly. When that ecosystem is destroyed by illegal mining or deforestation, their fundamental rights to life, culture, and sustenance are immediately erased. Furthermore, indigenous peoples safeguard an estimated 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity.
80%. That's incredible.
Yeah, they are quite literally the front line of this crisis.
That makes complete sense. Now, there was another specific group the text highlighted that really caught my eye. The resolution places a major emphasis on gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls.
Yes, it's a huge focus.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Usually when I read these high-level international documents, they paint women and girls purely as victims. Like, they talk about how women suffer disproportionately from climate disasters.
Which is statistically true, but yes.
Right, it's true. But this text specifically labels them as managers, leaders, and defenders of natural resources and agents of change. Why is it so crucial for a dense legal text to explicitly identify women as leaders, rather than just lumping them into a vulnerable group that needs to be protected?
What's fascinating here is that the UN is attempting to align international law with the actual reality on the ground.
Okay, what does that reality look like?
Well, in many developing regions, women are the primary gatherers of water, food, and fuel for their households. They are the ones physically managing the natural resources on a daily basis.
Right, they're literally doing the work.
Exactly. So if a local well dries up because of climate change, it is the women who have to walk 5 extra miles a day to find water. And they end up losing out on education or economic opportunities in the process.
Right, they have the most intimate knowledge of the local environment because their daily labor absolutely depends on it.
Exactly. The text recognizes that you cannot achieve true sustainable development if you ignore the expertise of the people doing the actual work. It demands the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in decision-making.
So it's shifting the narrative.
Yeah, big time. By legally recognizing women as managers and defenders of natural resources, the UN is stating that true environmental protection requires shifting the narrative from female vulnerability to female agency. It's a demand for inclusive leadership, recognizing that women are already actively defending the environment.
I love that distinction. It's so empowering. Okay, so we've established the right itself, we've mapped out the specific threats breaking down the bedrock, and we know exactly whose rights are being violated most acutely.
We've got the whole picture.
Almost. The final and arguably most important piece of this puzzle is the toolkit. Because I can hear a skeptical listener right now saying, this all sounds great, but does a UN General Assembly resolution actually have any teeth? Or is this just, diplomatic poetry?
Right. How do we actually enforce this?
Exactly.
Well, that is the ultimate question for any international law. A right only exists if it can be defended. And the resolution provides a very specific toolkit for how this right should be protected. And it starts with something that might seem surprising at first, which is information.
Yes. The text states that the exercise of existing human rights, specifically the rights to seek, receive, and impart information, and to participate effectively in government, is vital to the protection of a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment.
It is the primary enforcement mechanism. I mean, think about it. You cannot protect an environment, and you certainly cannot file a lawsuit to defend your human rights if you do not have accurate data about what is happening to your local ecosystem.
Right, you'd have no proof.
Exactly. If a corporation is secretly dumping toxins, or if a government is actively suppressing air quality data, The public simply cannot defend themselves.
And this brings us right back to the visual of the QR code we mentioned at the start of the deep dive.
Oh, perfect connection.
It is such a perfect, tangible metaphor for this exact concept. Like, a QR code is a tool designed to instantly seek, receive, and impart information.
Just scan it and...
Yeah. The UN is essentially stating that transparency, data sharing, and public knowledge are the primary weapons against environmental degradation. You basically can't fix what you aren't allowed to measure.
Exactly. The free flow of information allows citizens to hold actors accountable. And speaking of accountability, the resolution doesn't just point the finger at governments.
Right. It explicitly recalls something called the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Can you define what that actually is in this specific context?
Sure. So the guiding principles are a global standard established by the UN that basically says human rights aren't just the responsibility of states. Businesses have a distinct, standalone obligation to respect human rights, regardless of whether the local government is actually enforcing them.
Wow, that's huge.
It is. By dragging that specific framework into this environmental resolution, the UN is putting the private sector on notice.
So let me run a quick hypothetical by you just to make sure I get this.
Go for it.
Let's say a local factory is dumping unregulated chemical waste into my town's river, and my local government is just looking the other way because, well, they want the tax revenue.
A classic scenario, unfortunately.
Right. So is this resolution essentially saying that the factory isn't just violating some obscure municipal EPA code, but they are actively violating my human rights, and they have an international corporate responsibility to stop, regardless of what the local mayor says?
This raises an important question, and yes, that is exactly the legal philosophy this document is reinforcing.
That is wild.
It sets a global expectation that corporate liability extends to the human rights impacts of their environmental footprint. Now, as for how states and businesses are instructed to actually move forward, the resolution issues a really clear call to action.
What are the steps?
It urges all stakeholders to adopt policies, enhance international cooperation, share good practices, and significantly strengthen capacity building.
Okay, hold on. Capacity building is one of those classic pieces of UN jargon. What does that actually mean for us in the real world?
In this context, capacity building is the acknowledgement that you can't just declare a universal right if half the world doesn't have the technology or the money to enforce it.
Right. It's just empty words then.
Exactly. It means that wealthier, developed nations have an obligation to help developing countries, and the text specifically notes highly indebted poor countries and small island developing states by sharing technology, providing financial support, and helping them build the institutional strength needed to protect their environments.
Because it's fundamentally unfair to tell, like, a small island nation, they have to meet these complex environmental standards without giving them access to the green technology that wealthy nations have just been hoarding.
Precisely. And it also brings up the need to fully implement existing multilateral environmental agreements.
Which are things like the Paris Agreement on climate change, right?
Yes, exactly. Multilateral environmental agreements, or MEAs, are the binding treaties between multiple nations that target specific environmental issues. So like the Paris Agreement, or the Montreal Protocol that dealt with the ozone layer.
Okay, got it.
The UN is basically saying, we don't just need new declarations, we need you to actually follow through on the treaties you've already signed, because failing to do so is now officially a human rights violation.
They are really turning up the heat.
They are, and they note a very encouraging statistic, actually. A vast majority of states already recognize some form of this right to a healthy environment in their national constitutions or domestic laws. So this resolution is the UN validating and scaling up a movement that has already been fighting its way through local courts all over the world.
So what does this all mean? When we boil this incredibly dense, multi-page international legal document down to its absolute core, the General Assembly leaves us with 4 definitive declarations.
Right, the final takeaways.
First, it officially recognizes the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right. Full stop. Second, it explicitly notes that this right is related to all other international human rights laws. Like, they are legally tethered together now. Third, it affirms that promoting this right requires the actual implementation of the multilateral environmental agreements we just talked about. And fourth, it calls on absolutely everyone, states, international organizations, and businesses to scale up their efforts and cooperate to make this right a reality.
It is a profound synthesis. It takes decades of fragmented environmental science and binds it inextricably to the legal weight of human rights law.
And for you, listening right now, whether you are walking your dog, commuting to work, or just sitting at home, this document fundamentally reframes your legal relationship with physical reality.
It really does change everything.
The air filling your lungs right now, the water coming out of your kitchen tap, the stability of the climate in your region. These are no longer just environmental issues for scientists to debate on cable news. According to the highest international body in the world, these are officially recognized matters of your fundamental human rights.
Exactly.
If they are degraded by a corporation or neglected by a government, your rights are being actively violated.
It completely shifts the burden of proof. Demanding a clean environment is no longer just asking for a policy preference. It is demanding the protection of a basic, universally recognized right.
It is the software update our global operating system desperately needed. But as we wrap up this deep dive, there is one specific phrase repeated throughout this document that really lingers, and it points to a massive philosophical challenge.
Oh, I know the one you mean.
Yeah, the text repeatedly insists on protecting these rights for present and future generations.
Yes, and that concept of intergenerational equity is perhaps the most legally and philosophically mind-bending part of this entire resolution.
It's so heavy to think about.
It is. If environmental damage occurring today actively interferes with the human rights of future generations, it forces us to ask a staggering question.
Right with that.
How can international courts practically protect the legal rights of people who haven't even been born yet? How do we today calculate and weigh our immediate economic desires against the legally recognized human rights of a generation that is completely voiceless in our current political systems?
It is an incredible, heavy question to ponder. We aren't just responsible for ourselves anymore. International law says we are officially responsible for the human rights of the future. Thank you all so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. It's a complex document, but a necessary one to understand where our world is heading. Keep questioning the systems around you, and we will catch you next time.